Hey, I'm Vince. Welcome. I want to share with you a book that I think you should know about, especially if you find yourself in the United States of America at this time, or if you call yourself a Christian, or if that designation means anything to you or is meaningful to you in some way. The book I want to discuss is called The Flag and the Cross by Sam Perry and Philip Gorski. As an introduction, I want to start off with a criticism I have of the book in order to show you a little better how I'm going to approach it. And I also want to give you my biggest praise of the book. So criticism first. The book is written with an obvious slant and agenda. It's obviously against the movement of white Christian nationalism, and the agenda is to rally those people together that are also against white Christian nationalism to unite together to do something about it. This isn't hard to see since the subtitle of the book is White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. So you know right away where these authors stand and what they're trying to do. And in one sense, I'm always happy when authors and people in general identify their biases because we all have them. However, this book does not read like a rant. It is very interesting, and at least it gets as best you can on a subject like this to being fact-based. And so it could actually appeal to people who are white Christian nationalists. Like we tend to think of people who are white Christian nationalists as being militant. They won't listen to anything except their own dogma. And that's definitely true for many, but there's also a lot of people who are either not full-blown white Christian nationalists or who even, maybe they are, but they don't really, there's an inherent problem with that. So I think this book could have been used a lot differently. For instance, I think it could have been used in white churches, the breeding ground for white Christian nationalism, as a book study. It could offer an honest way for white Christians to talk about this. But it's immediately polarizing. And so as a pastor of a white Christian church who grew up in the South, I can say this book could have been used and could have done a lot of good in helping white Christians understand this problem, and even in helping those who are white Christian nationalists to understand why that's not such a good thing. But I don't know, maybe that's just me being optimistic. Maybe you just can't talk to people. I don't know. But anyway, that's my biggest critique. My biggest praise is actually very similar, and it kind of counters my biggest critique a little bit, because it's, even though they have an obvious slant, they did a great job just looking at data, making definitions, and trying to put their interpretation of data into a framework. I'm actually a person who didn't know very much about white Christian nationalism. I didn't know what the term meant, and I didn't know how it differed from patriotism. So I went out and looked at a bunch of different books before settling on this one. And many of the books on the subject are really just rants, and they're just kind of preaching to the people who already believe what they want to believe. And so they go out to get a book to make them feel good, I guess. And there's really no data that a lot of these books like this deal with. And if there is data, it's really just an anecdotal form. In The Flag and the Cross, however, Perry and Gorski do, in my opinion, a terrific job of laying out their data and dealing with it. So if you are a Christian nationalist or even a white Christian nationalist, I think you could actually get a lot out of this book, even if you're just looking at their data and trying to explain it in a different way. All right, let's look at the book. In this book, Samuel Perry and Philip Gorski have three things they're trying to do. The book's not laid out like that, but that's kind of how I read it and what I gathered. So the first thing they're trying to do is they're going to define white Christian nationalism. Second, they wanted to show how historically this definition developed, and finally, what they'd probably call the most important part of the book, how that story could have been changed at least 4 times in our American history, and how we still have opportunities to change it today. All right, to me, the first part is the most important and the most fascinating. Like my question was, why white Christian nationalism? Now, if you've seen any of my videos on James Cone, you probably know I don't have any problem in saying that white people have created a bunch of problems and that there's a lot of deep-seated racism that just comes along with being part of the majority, things that we don't even think about or things we don't even see. So that's not my problem. My problem is not against condemning white people or saying that there is still existent in the white community racism. But it seems to me like many authors on this subject especially use that terminology just to be divisive, just to get people who think the same to buy their book. What Philip and Gorski do is they show that it's actually definitional. Like, in short, there is a difference between a Christian nationalist and a white Christian nationalist. And here's how they figure that out. Now, they're sociologists, so there's going to be a lot of polling involved, a lot of charts, a lot of graphs. And in fact, in my opinion, that's the big appeal of the book. Like, that's the reason to buy it. If you're thinking about buying it and you don't even want to read it, go buy it because of just the charts and the graphs. And they're very, very easy to read and understand. So they start off by defining Christian nationalism. And they did this with a series of questions that, that basically are going to show this correlation between Christianity and politics and nationalism. So they ask questions like, do you think the United States is a Christian nation that should advocate Christianity? They ask questions like, is the Constitution divinely inspired? And is God the reason why the U.S. has been so successful in the past? Or even, should we allow prayer in public schools? And then depending on how people answered this question, they gave them a score on how Christian nationalists they were. And there was a fair amount of Christian nationalism in all denominations and all traditions and all races. And so when you asked questions about various things, you might get an awful lot of different kind of answers from Christian nationalists. But when you separated the data based on race, you got very consistent answers among white Christian nationalists. In fact, you got a very clear pattern when you graphed it, because depending on how white Christian nationalists they were, like right where they fit on that scale, the higher percentage they had of answering the question like all white Christian nationalists who were definitely 100% white Christian nationalists. All right, for instance, when asked, will white people be discriminated against next year? Now, you may say that's a very vague question. Okay, but let's just roll with it for a moment. Will white people be discriminated against next year? Black people on all levels said, no, they're not. White people are not discriminated against. But for white people, well, it depended on where you fell on this white Christian nationalist scale. If you were not white Christian nationalist, then you agreed with all the other minorities. No, white people don't experience discrimination. If you were definitely 100% Christian nationalist, then you 100% said, yes, white people are going to be discriminated against next year. And then depending on where you were on that scale, you got like a straight line correlation of the probability that you would answer that, yes, that white people are going to be discriminated against. Now, if you're saying, well, discrimination can mean a lot of things, I'm not exactly sure how I would have answered that, or I'm really trying to get a feel for this question, then you're missing the point. It's not whether you agree or disagree with the question, but like, why would those questions that show if you're a Christian nationalist have anything to do with a question about race, right? So all these questions about Christian nationalism, they only talked about Christianity in America and prayer in school, right? So why would that have anything to do with race? Why do we get such a clear pattern when asking seemingly unrelated questions? By the way, the opposite trend was seen when asked the opposite question. So that is, will black people experience discrimination next year? Well, if you're a minority, or if you're a white person who scored nil on the white Christian nationalist scale, you said, well, of course they will be. But the more white Christian nationalist you are, the more you would say, no, black people will not be discriminated against next year. Okay. So again, why? Why is there that correlation? Other issues that they polled included things like, was the Civil War about slavery? Are lax immigration laws to blame for COVID-19? Is it racist to call COVID-19 the Chinese virus? During COVID-19, who had the better information, Donald Trump or the CDC? And do you plan to get vaccinated? Should we have a civics test to vote? So an awful lot of these different kinds of questions like that. And what's interesting is that you always got the same thing. Not only did white Christian nationalists believe the same things, immigrants caused the COVID-19, saying Chinese virus is not racist, Donald Trump knows more than the CDC. But just like all the other polls, there was a straight line correlation in white people between how Christian nationalists you were, meaning how many of the questions that you answered that you thought the U.S. was a Christian nation, and what the likelihood was that you were going to answer that question like a white Christian nationalist. Now remember, It's so striking because the initial questions had nothing to do with vaccinations or voting or racism. The initial questions were just on if you think the government was Christian and should enforce Christianity. I think that's fascinating because there's some kind of groupthink going on here among people who think this, who are white and think this about the federal government. There's some kind of thing that they're all buying into, or there's some kind of hallucination that they're all buying into, or maybe if you are a white Christian nationalist, say they see the truth. I don't know, but something's happening here to where there's this correlation between this set of unrelated beliefs and this set of beliefs on the federal government and on race. Okay, so how do we explain that? Well, that gets into the second thing that they're trying to do in this book is to show why we have that correlation. And what Perry and Gorski say is that it's because they all buy into this same narrative. Basically, they're all reading the same novel on American history, right? Perry and Gorski find their answers in what they call the deep story. So this is a narrative of the United States, or it's more of a myth that has been told since the inception of the United States, and it keeps being retold to fit our current culture. Okay, so in their words, white Christian nationalists' deep story goes something like this. America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were traditional Christians who based the nation's founding documents on the Christian principles. The United States is blessed by God, which is why it has been so successful, and the nation has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But these blessings are threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences both inside and outside our borders. And you might have an awful lot of people who believe something like that could just be called Christian nationalism. But when you add whiteness to it, you also get this political agenda, or this idea of what America should be. And that is a nation ruled by white Christian men. The government is only good insofar as it serves white Christian values, and violence is good in the way that it can be used to enforce these values. So basically, Perry and Gorski have all this data that show that what Christian nationalists believe, and how if a Christian nationalist is white, their beliefs on other things start to coalesce also. So they say, in their opinion, the best way to explain it is they must be sharing the same narrative. And that narrative seems to include the things that I talked about above. All right. To bolster this is kind of interesting. What Perry and Gorski say is that basically they don't, white Christian nationalists, or the more white Christian nationalists you are, you don't seem to know very much about the real American history or our political history. And the way they found this out was to ask 5 very straightforward true-false questions about religion in American political history. And again, there was a straight-line correlation in white Christian nationalists between how Christian nationalists they were and how many questions they got wrong or right. So basically, white Christian nationalists don't have a good idea of the nation's actual history, but they can score 100% on this deep story. Well, that's saying something right there, right? The thing that should be pointed out, again, is not just if one buys into this deep story, but how if you are white, this deep story directs what you think about American politics and just how much it centers on race. And again, those aren't included in the original question. All right, the third thing they want to do in this book, and like I said, what they would probably say is the most important part of the book and why this book is written in the first place, is to show that various times throughout our history, we could have, as a nation, rejected the deep story in favor of inclusivity. For instance, after the Civil War and during the Civil Rights Movement, we could have turned to a more inclusive environment. And so the warning is, with the way politics are going, that there's going to be another opportunity coming up, probably pretty soon, and if we don't that we can get rid of this deep story. And they say if we don't get rid of the deep story and instead take on a more inclusive story, then we're headed for a second Jim Crow era. And then they describe what that might look like a little bit. All right, there's 2 more things that I want to mention because I found them extremely interesting. And the first, they said they answered this question: Why Trump? Because I was wondering, like this was a question that I had when Trump was impeached the very first time. The Republicans didn't just get behind it, like get him out of office, get Pence in there. It would have been so easy for them to do. And unlike Trump, Pence is a true evangelical. Like, right? I don't think anybody is going to disagree with me to say Trump doesn't know much about the Bible. He's quoted as saying that Jesus is a really good guy. He even said in one speech that Jesus was better than him. So, I mean, there's that. However, Pence knows what it means to be evangelical, and he clearly is one. So why didn't the Republicans or the white Christian nationalists just lean into this, get Pence as the president? And honestly, and this is just my thoughts, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, but I think Pence would have gotten an awful lot of support. In fact, I think he would have won the presidency the next time around. I even know a lot of Democrats that loved the idea of a Pence presidency just because Pence wasn't Trump, and they were very tired of Trump. So to Perry and Gorski, this is easy. They say white Christian nationalists care more about the fight than they do the faith. See, Pence had the faith, and that was easy to see, but Trump had the fight. He's what his voters wish they were and could be. He speaks out, and he's ready to fight. And so speaking of fight, there's also another, I guess, interesting thing was they asked questions on violence. Now, across the board, they found that all people would say they don't believe that violence is a good thing, right? But when it came to putting down dissent, white Christian nationalists were for the use of violence and even torture, right? And again, depending on how white Christian nationalists you were, there was a higher percentage that you were also for violence and torture to put down rebellion. All right, one last thing I want to mention because I found it interesting was in definitions of evangelicalism and Christianity. I had a congregant in my church ask me a few months ago what evangelicalism is. And I've been asked that question before many times, and I usually answer with like a historical point of view, or I'll say, this is what most evangelicals believe. However, all of a sudden it occurred to me that neither of those definitions are really adequate anymore. I wanted to be fair to evangelicals because there are some very good evangelical people. They're very faithful to Christianity. But I also didn't want to lie, right? Because to me, it just seems like the word has very little to do with faith anymore and a lot more to do with politics. As it turns out, I was right. I was very happy to read that. Well, in a way. Perry and Gorski also did a questionnaire asking people if they were evangelical, if they were Christian, and also asking for their denomination or their religious ties. Over 20% of those who said they were evangelical also said that they were not religious, not Christian, secular, or atheist. So what that says is this trend that evangelicalism, or the word evangelical, is more and more just coming to mean white Christian nationalists. More and more it means a lot less about faith and a lot more about your beliefs in politics. So there's a problem here with the word Christian also, because it's following the same trends. So in fact, I, along with a lot of other Christians I know, believe that it's time to retire that word and instead institute something like Christ follower or Christ believer in its place, because the word Christianity is kind of being overtaken by politics. All right, so that is my review or my summary of The Flag and the Cross. It's a very informative book. It's a book that I think you definitely should know about, especially as we get closer and closer to what could be or what looks like a white Christian nationalist takeover of not just the word Christianity, but also of American democracy. Unfortunately, it's a book that will most likely never be read by people who need to read it the most. So